Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back the Director of the Institute for Emerging Issues, Anita Brown Graham.
Welcome back from your break, everyone. You all must be feeling kind of nervous about this whole robot taking your job thing. You're being really compliant. We're excited to jump into this next segment of our program. We talked this morning about our challenges. We talked about some particular opportunities. I'm sitting at my table with County Commissioner Kitty Barnes from Catawba County. I know she wants to have a conversation about, okay, so how exactly, as a policymaker, do I think about creating jobs in my county? I suspect that's true for many of the policymakers in this room. So I'm pretty excited to now turn this program over to exactly that question. What will it take for us to capitalize on the opportunities to create and retain jobs, important jobs in our communities? The first speaker you'll hear from is Fidelity's Head of Human Resources, Bill Ackerman. I don't need to tell anybody in this room about the commitment that Fidelity has made to North Carolina, but I think it will be interesting for you to hear Bill's perspective on why and what it will take going into the future. He's going to let us in on the key question: as automation replaces some jobs, what human skills will be increasingly valuable? Bill will then introduce our next two speakers, one of whom is thinking about these issues on a global level, the other thinking about and doing them in a local community that many of our communities in North Carolina want to be. We like to learn from our competitors. It's called borrowing the best, and we're good at doing that in North Carolina. So without further ado, let me now introduce you to our first speaker from Fidelity. Bill, please join me on stage. It's wonderful to have you.
Good morning. So, reimagining talent and the associate experience, it can't be a solo flight. Figured I'd throw that in there last night, being I'm in North Carolina. I'm Bill Ackerman, and thanks for having me. You know, when titles go up in slides like that, what do they contain? A talk title, a name, a job function, and a company logo. So let me talk about the function of HR first. There are so many jokes about HR, I couldn't resist. It's easy to find them. So why did I put up this one? Because my kids watch The Office and think I'm Toby? Hopefully not. It turns out that even things as simple as what people wear to work can be a big differentiator for associates. Bigger picture, listening to employees and experimenting can help reimagine and deliver a great associate experience. I'll share some examples in a bit that are far more impactful than dress code. So that's me, a much better version of me. And I'm in a really cool role leading HR for Fidelity. So yeah, I'm an excited HR guy. Why is that? Changes in the environment make the people and talent equation incredibly fascinating. There's a big demand for strategic workforce planning, people analytics, and differentiation in the war for talent. Associates are constantly grateful for even small efforts at innovating the workspace. And I'm energized about reimagining both talent and the associate experience. And it's the single biggest job I have, managing a 45,000 person workforce at Fidelity. A little bit about Fidelity. You saw the logo. 25 million investors have relationships with Fidelity. That's about one out of every 4 American investors. And we're a market leader in many of our businesses. but we're also a major technology company. We've always recognized the power of technology to enhance the customer experience. And what's little known is that more than 1/4 of our workforce is in IT, to develop technologies to help people see and live through their finances in different ways. Fidelity in North Carolina, we've been here 15 years, have about 3,600 employees, and are positioned to grow more. We have many different roles and opportunities in North Carolina. Tech roles like cybersecurity, automating QA, big data analytics. We have major customer service and operating roles, including all of my HR operations are here in North Carolina. We have a state-of-the-art campus in Research Triangle Park, one that our employees love. And North Carolina is the home to our first innovation hub outside the Northeast, where we're constantly working on transformative business ideas. So I'm excited to be here. We have great associates in North Carolina and great prospects. There's a great skill set in North Carolina. We have companies, clients of ours, demanding experienced customer service and IT professionals, companies like SAS and Duke Energy. We work with great universities in the region: NC State, UNC Chapel Hill, Wilmington and Charlotte, North Carolina Central, and East Carolina. And we have outstanding partners in the community and government. And you guys have a great football team despite last night, and that's hard for a Patriots fan to say. So, let me talk about changes in the external environment. People want the Amazon experience. It's overplayed, but it's underrated. Or, I thought of another one, the hassle-free map. Think of life before Netflix. Went something like this. Husband disagrees with the spouse on what movie to get. Goes to the store and picks 3 movies. Go home, and they disagree again. Watch one of them, forget to return all 3, and pay a late fee. That's called a hassle-free environment. No, it isn't. That's a hassle environment. And Netflix gets rid of that stuff. Be it Amazon or Netflix, customers are not comparing their experiences to other financial services companies. They're comparing it to their latest digital experience. So that's the first thing. Number 2, our customer base is changing. People no longer retire the way Bismarck described it when they couldn't work in the fields anymore. They want to partially retire or pick a hobby and live in there someday. Millennial customers want to be serviced in totally different ways. And more wealth is controlled by women, who today are totally underserved by the financial services industry. Oops. Third one is new entrants into the financial services industry. So we have robo-cops, robo-advisors, algorithm-based companies deciding how to diversify someone's portfolio. And we have Google, an imperialist potentially coming into the financial services lens. So what do we need to win in this environment? Well, Fidelity feels that we need both talent and technology. We focus on blending human interactions with technology interactions because, in fact, less than 1/4 of investors want to have a pure technology interaction. So we need people. We need people who are idea-driven, who are tech-savvy, and who have empathy for customer relationships. And we have to compete against more than financial services companies. We got to compete against cool startups, we got to compete against technology companies, and we got to compete against companies who are redefining themselves, like GE. The changing workforce, the old and the new. You see, financial services used to be built on money managers, service workers assisting customers with paper forms, analysts with small data, parentheses, spreadsheets, and people reviewing paper resumes. But all this is changing. Yes, we need money management talent, but we need a lot more. We need digital natives building digital interfaces for all of our interactions. People don't want paper. We don't need small data skill sets, we need big data skill sets. Why? To predict customer behaviors. And we need open and collaborative workspaces, something that I've been fascinated by since I took this role. So let's talk about reimagining the talent and associate experience. Let's talk about talent acquisition. Digital, mobile, social is totally changing the way people look for and companies source talent. Boring job descriptions, resumes, and traditional interviews are becoming extinct. Let's talk about how do you keep employees that you already have. They can see options. They can see peer ratings. They can go on Glassdoor. And labor markets are competitive. Let's take North Carolina. 6% of the workforce here is employed in IT jobs. Anything greater than 4% means it's really competitive. So we're thrilled we're here, but so is everybody else. And so we got to win the war for talent, partially by reimagining the associate experience. So let's make things even better. Why did I pick this slogan? We've been successful for 70 years. Most people, when they get a job offer from Fidelity, take it. So we have high job acceptance rates. We have high engagement scores and very low voluntary attrition. And we have good career growth and mobility. But digital disruption is requiring us to completely change how HR does things. Traditional benefits are no longer enough. Changes in customer expectations are forcing us to have a different skill set. And traditional workspaces are not nearly enough. And I was at the Hunt Library at NC State a few weeks ago. Totally amazing. A library without books, or at least books that you can't see. That's what students are experiencing when they come into our workforce. But we also have to worry about our culture carriers, our veterans. So how do we balance all these things? Well, our vision is to deliver the best customer experience in the financial services industry. And to do that, we have to make our associate experience the best in the industry, period. So yes, HR has to be innovative. I want to talk about a few things we're doing, quickly. A career center. We're going to pilot a career counseling center, just like universities have. We've learned from our college and university partners who help prepare their students for career choices. We have to do a better job to prepare our workers for creative career pathing and modernizing what they want to do. Number 2, student loans. We have heard loud and clear that workers need help with their student loans. Yes, they want to save for their 401k and take advantage of attractive benefits offerings. So a few weeks ago, we began rolling out a new program, the first in the industry, to literally have a company pay the principal on the student's debt. 3 weeks later, we have 4,000 of our associates who have signed up for it. It's totally amazing, and it's all about paying down their loans. The other thing is I've consciously taken the word candidate for jobs out of our lingo, and I call it prospects. When we're looking for new customers, we talk about them as prospects. We're trying to attract new employees. They are prospective employees. The word candidate sounds too old school, and this is symbolic and powerful for recruiting. We've had to change our campaigns. We launched a non-traditional recruiting campaign here in North Carolina. We are #code-blooded are you. Because despite our great roots in technology, the fact that we spend billions in technology, and that 25% of our workers are in technology, we needed to increase awareness that Fidelity is a home for IT professionals, not just financial services. We've partnered with this firm called ReachHire, an organization that helps women get back into the workforce for those who have decided to take a career break. They go through a boot camp. They take a 6-month paid assignment, and it's a fantastic partnership to attract a critical talent pool, because especially in technology, where women hold less than 25% of the jobs. We had our first ReachHire class graduate in December, and we're gearing up for our next one. So looking to the future, consortiums like this are a reminder that we can't do it alone. There's no solo fights. We're working with the state to continue to produce a robust, highly skilled workforce. State officials are continuing to position North Carolina to attract great employers like us. We're working with nonprofits. 1 out of every 3 associates in North Carolina does community service, mostly in the educational and financial literacy space. We're working with universities to help with their curricula and with internships. We hired 1,000 people into our LEAP program, entry-level IT, last year. It's our biggest area in the world here in Carolina. So I want to thank you for this quick 10 minutes. I want to thank the state for recognizing Fidelity as one of the best places to work, healthy employer. Our associates are most proud of the Leader in Diversity Award. North Carolina is a great state and a great source of talent for us. We will continue to attract talent by having great job opportunities. We have to continue to develop the talent we already have in our facilities. North Carolina has supported our growth, and we're continuing to meet our commitments to that growth. We need this great ecosystem to be successful, and we hope to stay continuously involved with the Institute for Emerging Issues. Thank you very much.
When my son was 3 years old and he wouldn't sleep at night, I'd come in and I'd go, Justin, I'd like to talk to you about economic policy and city planning. And he, of course, would immediately go to sleep. So let me test something out on you. If you'll think of one of these three psychological constructs, either a pyramid, a cube, or a sphere. This will help me. I don't know if it'll help you, but so the pyramids, raise your hand, please. Those people are brilliant, and they're really high energy, and they want you to get right to the point. How about the cubes? Geniuses, they love all of the angles, and they want you to build a foundation and organize it in such a way that you come to a rational conclusion. And the spheres? Spheres are incredibly cool. They love puppies, and they love to surf. And so you can't lose with them. I think you've heard the global perspective of some of the challenges that we face, and you've heard the national perspective and the state perspective. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to give you a little background on Austin's approach, our strategic economic plan, and some of the ideas that we think are critical to our future to address the diversification of the economy. And even though I think you all know that we have this wonderful, glittering prosperity, our economy is incredible, but also in the shadows there's a lot of poverty. So we're very aware of the fact that there's two things that make a community great and prosperous. There's the quality built environment, and then there's the creative workforces. And when you have those, whatever kind of government, whether it's city, county, state, federal, then you're strong, you're growing, things are happening. But if either one of those starts to collapse, if you have rapid growth and you don't know how to organize the economics of it, if you do sprawl 7 times more expensive, if you make poor decisions, horrible, then you end up with big white elephants. On the creative side, if your creative economy is growing, then you do fantastic. But as poverty grows, you have to subsidize it. And the larger the poverty population, the greater the demands on the economy, and the less of a return you have in terms of your ROI. So what I'm going to talk to you about is our solutions and how we're measuring our ROI. Let me start by saying that, as you know, you picked up from Dambisa, there's 2 billion people move into cities. And so what does that mean? It means that our cities, whether we want to or not, are going to be the cradle for all the growth and how we solve all our problems. So we have to figure the economics of that out and make it work smartly. So in the strategic plan that we've put together, we address both of these elements. And I'm going to talk primarily about the Einstein project, which I think you'll be interested as a big part of our solution. But I'd like to be able to walk you through also just a little bit about the way Austin has diversified its economy and how we feel that that will make us insulated from the next recession. So I'm going to look again. This doesn't seem to be it, but if someone can help me advance the slides, that'd be appreciated. So this is the pillars of our economy in Austin and the Economic Development Department. We want to create prosperity for all individuals, for all businesses and entrepreneurs, and of course for the neighborhoods and communities. And then together, by doing that, we become a really robust economy that's smart and creative. So if you can advance it once more, please. So Austin's Economic Development Department, this is our portfolio. It's very interesting. There's only one other place in North America that's structured like our economic development department. That's Toronto, where it's a fusion of all the creatives and all the traditional economic development. The reason that's important is because usually the creatives are very liberal and don't have a business sense to some degree. And the traditional economic development, they're very traditional. And so we've been able to fuse the two together. This has been incredibly effective. We did a snapshot of the Austin economy before and after the recession. And where the rest of the economy was beginning to collapse or flatten out, the creative economy grew 25% to $4.3 billion, 49,000 jobs, and $71 million worth of new taxes. So that's what kept us to be the top economy in America. So we felt it's very valuable and very important to nurture that. As you know, the recessions hit there've been 12 since World War II. And so they come every 3, 5, and 9 years. Last one's over in 2010. You do the math. So we're in a hurry to develop systems that protect what we're doing. The first area is our global business division, and just a few things about each one of these. The Einstein project is based upon, we're very good at economic incentives. We've incentivized Apple, as you know, to build that huge campus there, eBay, Facebook, Samsung, all of these really neat high-tech companies have come there. Well, the incentive system is very transparent. It has won 100% transparency by a watchdog called Incentives First, USA. Anyway, our incentives return on investment for the city of Austin is about 238%. So you know what you get in a bank. So after we paid for the police department, after we paid for the fire department and the libraries, our incentives are giving us a 238% profit. So what we've done is we've gone, okay, well, then why don't we use that to get people out of poverty? Since that's a drag on the economy. If we get all these people out of poverty by incentivizing our high-tech companies to help us, what is the bang for the buck there? So I'll talk about that in a minute. But we also have, in that unit, we fund all 5 chambers of commerce, all of the workforce organizations, all of our partnerships with the universities. We put together our strategic economic plan internationally, and it won the world's top award. We feel it's very, very important to get a piece of the trade. Texas has $200 billion worth of trade. We only get $10 billion. We want to increase it 1-2% a year. We'd like to get those extra $1 billion of trade. And so we're using the diaspora of the city. We use our cultural diversity as an economic strength. So we have about 20 or 30 different diaspora, and we empower those business people who speak the languages and know the policies of the other countries to lead from the Asian chamber and the Black chamber and the Hispanic chamber to draw in business to us. Science City Network. We have, any fans from history? A few. Well, we have taken something, a 13th century concept called the Hanseatic League, and we have put together 11 trade cities that are like Austin around the world, and we've developed a creed to partner with them to get access to 175,000 high-tech parks. If you can imagine Research Triangle parks all over the world, and we're connected to them. And so that really helps us to create our small companies become multinational faster, and theirs then become invested in Austin as well. This second area, cultural arts, we're very proud of that. We fund 280 cultural arts organizations every year. And we do that by using hotel occupancy taxes, but we also train all the arts organizations how to do cultural tourism and also how to run businesses, so that they're able to aid us in collecting more dollars. We're embedding them throughout the city in our areas that are being revitalized to make them more culturally attractive. Small business. Small business is our largest division. We've got 34,000 small businesses. We've got 18,000 that we contact on a regular basis. We've set up a family business loan program to help them get access to capital. We give them 1.5% loans. For every $35,000 that they borrow, they have to create a job, and half of those jobs have to be for disadvantaged people within their community, so it's a job-creating program. And we partner with local banks and credit unions, and it's working out great. That division also has won the Harvard Ash Government Award as the best in the United States for connecting small businesses to money. There's some other items to it that are pretty interesting. In the redevelopment division, we have a portfolio of about $9 billion worth of redevelopment projects. You know, when I started off talking about how you have to have the physical quality growth of a city as well as the creative economy, whenever a city gets into this hyper growth like we're doing, or remember when Atlanta did it and for 10 years was the fastest growing city in America, and different communities do that. Well, how do you calculate the return on investment? How do you eliminate the economic blind side of your projects before you invest billions in them? Well, we designed the Envision Tomorrow software. We've created a software that is connected to the university's supercomputers. And so before we put billions of dollars into a future urban rail system, we'll wrap the real estate around it, maybe a mile green area of bicycle trails to capture how many people, and then we'll run the numbers. How much taxes will it generate? How many jobs will it generate? What will it do to the family disposable income? And we can do this on giant 3D 40-foot television screens at the university and invite the citizens to participate in it. So we're developing a way that as we grow, we prevent ourselves from making billion-dollar mistakes. And this unit of redevelopment does that. We're also, for one of our major projects, the Miller development is the old airport that we've converted into a new giant urban village. That just won the American Planning Association Secretary's Award a few months ago as the best economic development project in America. And other things, excuse me, but they're doing a great job. And then last, music. How cool is it that you have a music division? We did a survey, a census of all the musicians, and we found out most of them are poor. And so we're trying to help them get royalties, and we're helping them trying to get housing, and we're helping them try and grow within the economy on a global basis. So we've set up an alliance of music cities. We're setting up partnerships to create a way for them to collect their royalties. You know, you go to BMI or you go to ASCAP, you go to these different organizations where they take 15 to 20% cut, and that they're finding it difficult to tackle how do you actually get your money back even if you've got royalties. The point of all of this is that when you have poverty and it's a drag on your economy, you have to figure out how do you eliminate it and what kind of money do you save. So we have calculated how many of the hard-to-employ people and how do we get them jobs? How many of the musicians and artists are poor? Because they're so important to protecting us in a rounded, complete economy during the recession. We want to make sure we don't price them out of the market. For all of the kids, what we think might be as many as 40,000 children in poverty, how do you deal with that? How do you prevent them from going into a next generation of poverty? So if we can go to the next slide, I'll walk you through, I think, pretty quickly here. These are our goals. Some of the solutions, we've been putting together an inland port strategy in advance of the opening of the Panama Canal for some years now. The NAFTA corridor runs through Austin, and so we've taken 3,500 acres of industrial land that sits astride the NAFTA corridor, and we've given it a triple free port, and we have organized our Opportunity Austin strategy to recruit distribution companies. Trade will double as it comes through the Panama Canal, so cities that have inland ports, they get double the trade, right? And for every Walmart distribution center or Costco distribution center, you get 1,000 hard-to-employ people working there as forklift operators making $45,000, $50,000 a year with benefits. So it's a real boon to the economy. Cultural diversity, one of the things that I think is very important about Austin is that I think 22% of our entrepreneurs are immigrants. And so we're very proud of the fact that we use cultural diversity as a way to grow the community economically, not only locally, but internationally. I think go to the next slide, please. So this is kind of the hardcore part of it, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you mostly about the Einstein project, if you don't mind. So we've calculated that there's about 40,000 kids in poverty in Austin, a whole generation of kids that if they stay in poverty for the next 50 years, we're going to have to build affordable housing for 40,000 people once they become adults. We're going to have to provide daycare, food stamps, more criminal justice facilities, more police facilities. We've roughly calculated that if we eliminate a generation of kids from poverty, 40,000, that we would save about $50,000 a year over every year they work, I use my own 18 to 68, 50 years. So when we ran the numbers, the return on investment was off the charts. It ended up being an equation. It ended up being 1E plus 11, 11 being the zeros. And so we knew that the return on investment, if we could do this, would be really great. There were great challenges to do poverty elimination earlier. Everybody knows about the Johnson-era war on poverty, which was very successful, but they didn't measure the outcomes monetarily, so people gave up. The GI Bill, great outcomes. They don't measure the return on investment monetarily. So we thought, okay, we're the top economic development department in the country. We've got an incentive system that generates 238% return on investment. Let's incentivize all of the companies in Austin, including all our high-tech companies, to tutor these kids for 10 years, put them under contract for 10 years, only for jobs that pay $100,000 or more, or how to set up their own companies. And if these 40,000 kids can be tutored for 10 years by the smartest people in Austin, we think we can graduate them into being a whole generation of Einsteins. So we've hired the University of Texas's Ray Marshall Center. Ray Marshall was the Secretary of Labor under Jimmy Carter. And we are measuring both the pathway of these kids. Now there are 40,000 kids. Some of them are 1-year-olds, some of them are 10-year-old. So it's about 2,300 kids a year. So it's a very doable project if you break it down. But we've got a team of Google, IBM, National Instruments. So the companies are all starting to get engaged. And by March, we'll be incentivizing, we hope will be the first 20 companies. 1 or 2 of the companies have said, we'll train at least 1,000 kids a year, 10,000 kids, over a 10-year period in our area of expertise. But if they drop out, then maybe you can switch them over to IBM or you can switch them over to others. But we feel like that this intervention on economic development to remove a whole generation of kids from poverty will have create a permanent improvement in the economy of Austin. I was making a presentation to a group at the National Chamber in Washington about the Envision Tomorrow tool. Instead, we talked about the Einstein project. And one of them asked, how many kids are in poverty in the United States? And it's 15 million kids. What happens if they're not in poverty? What if the businesses were incentivized to tutor them? What would that do to the economy? Well, in fact, it would eliminate the national debt over 50 years. It would transcend the way that we do business. You can't cut your way out of economic growth. You can't tax your way out of economic growth. But what if you find this huge, difficult drag on the economy and you transform all these kids into an asset, a whole generation of Einsteins? So anyway, those are some of the solutions that we're coming up with in Austin that we're working on. We're very proud of them. Be happy to answer any questions that you have. My friends at Georgia Tech said I never stop talking. Remember the 2 B's, be brief and be seated, so I'm going to do that. But thank you very much. I didn't want to go through more slides.
Bill, Dambisa, Kevin, thank you all for really provocative presentations. So this is the session where we go from talking about these big, heady issues to focusing in on what this begins to mean for individuals and how we think about responsive strategies at the company level, at the global level, at the local government level. I promised my friends out here that before the end of the day, they would feel as though they had been drinking from a fire hose. Turns out, based on all the questions that have come in to me, I feel like I'm drinking from a fire hose. This is a time for you all to queue up if you want to ask your questions in person. I have a bunch of questions, and I'm going to try to consolidate some of them and just mix them up amongst the panelists so that we can get as many answered as we can. Does that work? I mean, it's not really a democracy, but it just feels better if we act like it is. Does that work? All right, thank you. All right, so Dambisa, a bunch of questions coming in on education. I think you really hit a nerve when you suggested that our children today are less prepared than we were a generation ahead of them. Two ways those questions have been framed. The first is, so what do we do about it?
So I think it's a great question, and it's a question my answer is framed from somebody who was raised in Africa. So my primary, secondary, and university were all in Africa. And the way that our government approached it actually has been quite dynamic. When I was born, and it was post-colonialism, and the emphasis there was to really focus on primary education, and actually the evidence is that primary education returns are incredibly significant, and the investment should be at the primary level, and if you start investing at secondary and tertiary level, the returns are actually diminishing. It's not, and by the way, I should say that this is a very difficult topic because it will to some sound like I'm saying don't go to school, which is what I'm not saying, but I am saying that the manner in which people are getting educated today has to evolve. I think that there's been an underinvestment, certainly in the emerging markets and potentially even in developed countries, in vocational skills, skills that are more transferable, more versatile. And if you think about the way in which education is approached in places like India and China, I think that there has been much more of an emphasis in that. In the green room, we were talking a little bit about a Gallup poll in particular, talking about unemployment, global unemployment. I think it was a Gallup poll that said that 50% of the world's population is unemployed. And my reaction to that was, well, you know, those numbers tend to not give a true picture of the situation because a lot of people in the emerging markets are actually are not employed in a formal sense, but they nevertheless get up every morning and they'll be at the roadside selling tomatoes, etc. So I think in the same way we have to think about reframing our definition of education. I think there are other portals, there are other ways of providing education that is necessary. I do think that it is a public good, and so therefore the government does need to take a lead at the primary level because we do have to have some level of basic education. I think at the secondary and the tertiary level, I am pleased to say that I've spent a lot of time in the US listening and also learning a lot about some of the innovations and more cutting edge advances that people are involved in education, some of them quite unpalatable. You know, I know there's a big debate about charter schools and common core programs, etc. But I will say that the evidence has not always been good. So for example, there's mixed evidence in charter schools. But I think that on the good side, we do need to be more innovative and maybe in a way tear up those strictures. On the downside is that it's such a cost if you have an uneducated population because then you have a generation lost. And so it is very essential that we get it right, and it's not been such an easy easy answer.
I tend to agree with Dambisa. I think that really that I think there's an element of agreement that it's got to be public-private partnerships. You saw when the president of the owner of Facebook gave $100 million to what was it, Newark school system, yeah. And the grades went down. I think that the businesses have to be involved in educating this next generation of kids in what really works. It can't be just for tests. It's got to be public-private partnerships that make this work. I think that if we do that, and we find new revenue streams. That's why I like the idea of incentivizing the businesses to participate. Because if, in fact, they participate out of vested interest, they will make sure that the kids learn. The school systems and the nonprofits are doing fantastic, and this would provide them new revenue streams as well. But I think that there's a labyrinth of people trying to help, and the return on investment is not being measured in a systematic way, and that's what is holding us back.
So I tried to set Dambisa up by bringing out a real model corporate citizen doing lots of this kind of work. And yet, Dambisa, your conversation about the three conversations that are happening and the need to figure out a way to consolidate those into a single conversation created a little bit of eye rolling in the questions that came up. So there are a bunch of them that are, corporations have been talking about corporate social responsibility forever. How are we going to get them to really be serious about this? Is it possible at all that we can get them to divorce short-term profits from these longer conversations about economic growth and what happens to people? And so, Bill, if you don't mind being put on the spot, would you talk a little bit about exactly what Kevin's saying? How are you partnering with community institutions, whether that's the public sector or not-for-profit sector, in some of the things that you're doing?
Representing all of corporate America.
Yeah,
this
there
is
you
good.
go.
which I'm disqualified to do. So we do many different things. Okay. As I tried to make the point, our associates are the most important thing, and we have ways to attract candidates. And unfortunately, everything is starting earlier in the path. So our incentive is to develop relationships with kids much earlier in the process than when I went to school. So one thing is we are offering, we have people who are high school students who do internships with us. 2 weeks ago in Boston, we had high school women who are interested in financial services but have no idea what it is, and we spent 3 whole days with them. Because that's where they are exposed, because they don't know what the real world opportunities are. So that would be like in the high school thing. With colleges, particularly down here in North Carolina, this constant interrelationship with colleges is really important. So I'm the captain of Boston University, because that's where I work. So I sit down with the deans of their schools, and what he'll say is 70% of the academics think that they prepare their students for work. And yet, and what he says to me is 20% of the companies think the people coming in are prepared for work. And so there's this big gap. So whether it's investing in the curriculum, whether it's giving them project-based learning, whether it's mentoring students, these are all incredibly important things as long as you find the influencers at these universities. In terms of community involvement, we spend a lot of time on community involvement. As I said quickly, mostly in education and financial literacy. And that's all volunteer time from us because it helps our brand in the community, which is important. But it's so worthwhile. So if you go to a school and you physically upgrade the school, which we are always doing in the community, but also back it up with real substance about curriculum, and I'm talking grade school and elementary schools, it's incredibly powerful. So the incentives are there for companies that kind of get it, and hopefully we're one of those.
I think you did a very good job representing the entire corporate sector. Give him a hand, please. All right, I am way out of time, but I've got one person who's been standing at the mic for a while, so if you could ask a short question, I'll have somebody respond to it, and then we shall move on.
My question is for you, Dambisa, and about, right here.
Oh, there, sorry.
Thinking about the demographic change, we've had and are still having a huge demographic change in North Carolina. And I know that a lot of people who are here, some of whom may never speak English, will never be able to get educated enough to approach some of these job opportunities that have been talked about. So my question to you is, have you witnessed anything with the changing of technology and job opportunities that's sort of like an alternative? I'm thinking like moving towards agrarian pockets or anything like that. Have you witnessed anything like that worldwide that might be able to be applied to some groups of people who, for whom education might be out of reach?
Dambisa, I'm going to ask you to try to answer that question really shortly, and then I want to see if Kevin wants to weigh in, because Austin was where North Carolina is going some time ago.
Okay, so I guess very quickly, the only thing, maybe my statement will be broader than just your question, and I'm not trying, it's not a cop-out, but I think what I'm trying to get across here is that in order for us to address any of the issues that have been raised here, I do think we need to be less stricture-based, and that is a very difficult thing. I think people are very locked into their ideologies. They're very, very locked into the cadence of the way things have always worked and therefore must always work. And all I will say is that I spent an hour with the Chinese president, who, I'm 100% believe in liberal democracy, 100% believe in market capitalism. I left there really quite challenged in an ideological sense, and really think that all I'm essentially trying to say is that the takeaway from that was that it's really important for us to think about those types of alternatives, and maybe going back to the idea of vocational training. So I wouldn't say, your specific question was, have I seen anything like that? I have, but not necessarily at a scalable level. In small pockets in Israel, they do a lot of those types of initiatives. But nevertheless, I think that our way of thinking, politically and economically, also needs to be go through a transformation in terms of being more open-minded about how to address these issues.
Kevin, do you have a 30-second weigh-in?
Well, I think America's at the crossroads in how we approach this. This is a huge problem. The issue of equity and the diversification of our economy, and I think that we have to do this to scale, and the only way to do it, I think there's an agreement generally that public-private partnerships are essential to tackling not only our educational problems, but our infrastructure problems. And how we do that and how we structure that, whichever is the first state that actually gets it right,
It'll be
or the
North
first
Carolina.
city, go for it. I'm learning an awful lot here. I'm sure we're going to share information, but I think the solution, I believe, is in involving the private sector in a more organized way, and doing it under contract, not doing it on a voluntary basis. Do it in a way that you can measure it for at least a longitudinal period of time, so that when the next recession hits, you're still plowing through it. When the next recession hits, the poorer get poorer. The companies can't afford to do that. But I think this is a great question, and I think it can be done to scale, can be done to scale here. It's certainly going to be done to scale in Austin.
All right, let me ask you to join me in thanking this delightful panel. So keep the questions coming. We're going to imprison our guests backstage so that they can respond to some of those questions online through social media. So keep sending them in. All right, so I made you a few promises at the break, and I want to move forward with fulfilling one of them now, which is to give you a chance to reflect a little bit on what you've heard this morning individually, and then to talk with each other at your tables. So, you heard me say earlier that our working group came up with these 10 strategies, and then our great forum ambassador winnowed them down to 5. There should now be a forum ambassador at every table. Can you wave your hand if you're a forum ambassador? Look around your table, identify that person. They will be facilitating these tabletop conversations. If for some reason your forum ambassador has gone rogue, just nominate somebody else at the table to be a forum ambassador. So in this first conversation, we want to focus on those strategies that really ask us to think about how we enhance engagement among community stakeholders, especially business. You heard that from this great panel. Ultimately, the kinds of new structures in the labor market that we will face are such that no single sector will be able to resolve all of the disruptive impacts. So how are we going to organize ourselves in communities and as a state to do a better job of coming together and having that singular conversation that Dambisa challenged us to have? As you begin to think about what you've heard this morning, I want to encourage you to take out your phones and respond individually to this next polling question. My question is, of the 3 strategies below, which do you think will be the most effective and feasible in meeting this Have One Conversation challenge? Here are the 3 options that the forum ambassadors are offering for your consideration. First, that we need to figure out a way to get people together and develop more differentiated programs. Second, that we've got to spend more time thinking about enhanced career pathways. And third, again, something that you've heard raised time and time again this morning, the importance of increased opportunities for project-based learning. If you had to pick one, because you only have $1 to spend, where would you spend your dollar? Okay, so notice how you all have been programmed to look up to see whether you voted with the majority of people in the room. Unfortunately, we won't tell you until the end of your tabletop conversations. What I want you to do now is turn to the people at your table, share with them the way you voted, select one of these topics for conversation at your table. Again, if you've got a forum ambassador, that person will help facilitate the conversation. If not, you actually have a sheet on your table that tells you the 2 questions that we want you all to talk about. You have, my friends, 10 minutes. So I encourage you to get to talking now. I'm sorry to be the one to break up these great conversations. Maybe I'm not the one to break up these great conversations. Just start calling out my friends by name. Hey, Joe, stop talking. Yeah. All right, so I hope that you all have had a chance to wrestle just a little bit with some of this content and to set up whomever is going to represent your tables, whether that's the forum ambassador who came into the room knowing that there were a forum ambassador or the one who just got drafted, to share a little bit of the perspective coming out of the conversations. We've talked a bit about some disruptive in a negative way impacts of technology, but we've also heard that technology can help us solve some of the very challenges we will have in the future of work. And so we have a feature in this year's forum where we're going to have 3 people. Some are tech visionaries, some educators, some working in communities, who are actually thinking about how they deploy technology and new institutional frameworks to help people connect to jobs. The very first of these spotlights is Henry Rock, and let me now welcome him to the stage.
Thank you. Real pleasure. All righty. Good morning. It is still morning, just about afternoon. My name is Henry Rock. I'm the Executive Director of City Startup Labs, and we're an entrepreneurs academy that is based in Charlotte, North Carolina. And we have just wrapped up a pilot that we have done for the last couple of years with the Urban League of the Central Carolinas. Now, our focus is on teaching Black male millennials entrepreneurship, and we're very intentional about that. We just, as I said, completed this pilot and are now moving on to UNCC, where we will be establishing a center of excellence and doing that in affiliation with Ventureprise there. So I was asked today to address this question, this essential question of how technology entrepreneurship affects the development of, or job creation, I should say, for minorities. And I'd like to really look at this question in three parts. First of all is job creation, preparation, and access. So when it comes to job creation, size doesn't matter as much as the age of a company. All right, the Kauffman Foundation states in a study that they've done that the real major emphasis on job growth has taken place in the public sector with those companies that have been 5 years or less. 5 years or less. And when we look at entrepreneurs and startups, they are really the drivers of this growth. Were it not for them, we would have had no net job growth in the US economy. No net job growth. In addition to that, when you look at entrepreneurship and business churn, these are the things that really lead to innovation, productivity, and competition. And we have to look at this also from a public policy perspective, and that is, how do we encourage entrepreneurship, especially amongst minority entrepreneurs? Because they can be the drivers of job growth. I like to call it 21st century workforce development. Now, the next thing is preparation, job preparation. The Labor Department says that the next 7 to 10 fastest growing jobs over the next 10 years are going to be in the STEM fields, and that 16 of the 25 highest paying jobs are going to be requiring STEM preparation. And if you're a STEM worker, that you're going to be making 26% more than your non-STEM peers. Now, when it comes to African Americans, a great source for STEM talent is the historically Black colleges and universities and the outsized productivity that these represent. Now, these universities, by the way, 3% of total colleges and universities around the country, but they produce 40% of the STEM degrees, 60% of the engineering degrees earned by Black college grads. But let's face it, it's really not just about diversity for diversity's sake. A McKinsey report says that those companies that are racially and ethnically diverse are 35% more likely to financially outperform their counterparts. So diversity, as I see it, can be a real competitive edge. And the interesting thing is that it doesn't have to be for corporate America, but for our local, regional economies and economic development, but also our national our national economic vitality. And the thing is, as I see it, is that we are not using our extraordinary and unique diversity to our global advantage. Now, the last thing and perhaps the most troublesome thing is access. There was a Atlantic Monthly poll that was done, and with a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being absolutely abysmal, Silicon Valley's racial diversity is a 7. A 7. All right? And when they look at the data, they see that the lack of black tech workers, based on or relative to their percent of the population, is even worse than women and Hispanics in the industry. And this I see as a fundamental issue that we have to deal with if we're going to have any hope of being able to change this problem. Because what is the underlying thing here? The context that makes this up, is our relationship as a country with our black citizenry, as I see it, both historically and also presently. It's this context that has black folks largely marginalized and looked as misfits, not being able to do one thing or the other, and largely on the sidelines, watching the entrepreneurial parade go by. So I suggest that what we ought to do is to come to real terms, to honest terms, speak forthrightly about the need for us to look at the insidious, implicit, in some cases explicit, biases that lead to what Dr. Eddie Gaud, who is the Princeton professor in his latest book, Democracy in Black, calls the value gap. I think we need to look at this value gap that has us perceiving others in a way that has them deemed less than they ought to be, less productive, less inclusive. So what I'd like to do before I sum this up, because I know I'm getting the hook here, what I like to do here, though, before I sum this up, is to say that as a recent article in the Bloomberg magazine had suggested, and that was that instead of us thinking in terms of entrepreneurship from the point of view of how we can hire a new tech or make a new tech diverse workforce, why don't we think in terms of how we can increase diversity on the part of those who are starting companies? And that's really what we're up to here at City Startup Labs, right? And lastly, I'd like to say this, and that is that according to the Misfit Economy, it's a recent book published, according to that Misfit Economy, those of us who are in the midst of seeing business churn and economic churn, what we need to consider is that it is the misfits, like the guys that I'm working with, who can actually be the difference in terms of economic prosperity and economic stagnation. I really do want to thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. Bye.
We're grateful to Henry for asking the hard questions in Charlotte, to the University of North Carolina at Charlotte for taking up the mantle, for really pushing this question of how we look at changing demographics in North Carolina as an opportunity rather than as a challenge. Our next speaker is doing much of this kind of work. across the nation. Philip Auerswald will stay on this thread of entrepreneurship, and he'll specifically talk to us about why supporting and cultivating entrepreneurs is so critically important, not just for the sake of business, but for the sake of what he calls the promise of prosperity. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Philip Auerswald. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. And thank you, Henry, for having mentioned the Kauffman Foundation. My name is Philip Auerswald. I'm an economist by training, George Mason University and the Kauffman Foundation. You hear a lot from economists about sectors of the economy. You can think about energy sector, health sector, transportation sector. And I'm going to suggest for the next 25 minutes that you forget about all that and just think about one sector in the economy, which is the forest sector. Not necessarily that difficult to do in North Carolina because you have a great tradition there, but I want to generalize it. So just the forest sector. Okay, so what do you have in the forest sector? Well, one thing that we have in the forest sector is we have the canopy, right? We have big trees. So from the sky, it looks like the canopy is all that there is, right? So you got GE, you got Walmart, you got Exxon, and that really looks like pretty much the totality. But as we know, if you've ever been in a forest, particularly a rainforest, below the canopy, way down below, there's the scrub. And there's a lot of biomass in the scrub. And at the eye level, at the human level, that's what we see and interact with, right? You have to take a special tour to get up in the canopy, right? But that's sort of like our level. And the scrub is small business, right? And so most small businesses, as we know, don't grow. They constitute now just less than 50% of the economy, but traditionally have been more. But there's an important part of the economy that is in between small and large, right? And that's the small and growing, and that's the growth sector, and that's entrepreneurship, okay? Entrepreneurship is that which was small and can grow. So why is that important? Well, if you've ever been in a rainforest, you know that this happens, right? The old falls over, and it releases nutrients to create the new. Economic vitality is the capacity to take released nutrients and reconfigure them into something new and of value. Something of substantially enough new value creation that it can challenge the old, that those small trees can become large trees. So at the Kauffman Foundation recently, what we've decided to do is take this metaphor of the entrepreneurial ecosystem somewhat more literally than has been done in the past. There's a great tradition in this direction. Herbert Spencer in the late 19th century was an economist better known than Adam Smith, whose whole work was based upon the application of evolutionary theories in every domain of science, including economics. But we've taken this up again, and this is a paper that I wrote. My colleague Dane Stangler has had other work along these lines, and it's about enabling entrepreneurial ecosystems. And what we try to do in this paper is really take a sort of existing scholarship on the dynamics of entrepreneurial ecosystems and sort of break it down into a model that can be operational. So first of all, before we get into the kind of the phases of the model that are going to be the focus of sort of my remarks today, let's just take a look at where this sort of figure eight is going, right, and what the axes are. So we have two axes, which are really sort of potential, which is the sort of the energy that's captured in the economy. And we can just think about it as the raw number of transactions, just sort of, and also this sort of capital, whether it's intellectual capital, human capital, all the embedded capacities that might exist in a region. And then connectedness, well, we know what connectedness is, right? And that could be contractual, it could be relational, but it's all those sort of dense interrelationships that also define a region. So let's think about this sort of energy and connection as two important dimensions. And what I want to propose to you is it's not just a question of a healthy entrepreneurial ecosystem or an unhealthy one, but it's a question of moments in time and understanding where you are in a moment of time and what strategy makes sense for that moment of time. So now I'm going to start with one moment in time, which is what in the ecological literature is called exploitation, okay? And this is sort of like this sort of new, when you have a clearing, And when there's, just after a burn or, after a forest fire or maybe a large storm, there are clearings, and those clearings create opportunity in ecosystems. So what does that correspond to in economic ecosystems? Well, this is Truman's Brewery in Brick Lane in London. Truman's Brewery was founded in 1666, and by the end of the 19th century, it had become the largest brewery in the world. By the end of the 20th century, it had gone out of business. And it was a massive sort of multi-acre property with these huge buildings that were vacant. And what London did was enable this to become sort of a coral reef for business, right? And inside this coral reef, there's just been this incredible energy that has been unleashed of just small-scale business, small shops, food stands. And if you walk along Brick Lane, and all of us have been to sort of Sunday markets and Saturday markets, and this is a sort of wonderful feature of economic life now all over the world. And we have food trucks and pop-ups, but I was really astounded when I was last in London last winter, and a friend of mine who's a fan of this sort of new emerging economy in London took me on a tour, and we walked for over 2 hours. It's sort of one unending Saturday market into another, all centered around Brick Lane. So it's this incredible energy that's come about out of Brick Lane and out of this old property of Truman's Brewery. What's striking about the date 1666 is those of you that have an interest in things of these type might immediately know that was the year of the Great Fire in London. And there was a lot of sort of new territory, new fields that opened up, new fields of opportunity that opened up in London. And it's really partly that Great Fire that created London as the city as it is today. Second phase in this ecological model is conservation. And this is a phase we're very familiar with. The conservation model is when everything is working well. It's when everything has come together and all of those dense interrelationships exist and all of those networks exist and energy, potential energy, the captured energy in the system is at its maximum, right? So a place like Silicon Valley today or Detroit in the 1970s and 60s, really where all of the networks had aligned, right? The challenge with systems that are at this conservation stage is that they, of course, become conservative, that they build up bulwarks against change, that they like their preferred position. And the one thing about bulwarks against change is that they eventually lead to release. Release of energy, or in the case of New Orleans, release of water. The failure of the levees in New Orleans is a literal instance of what I'm talking about, because it did create a devastation that then was a platform for change, an ongoing process in New Orleans, just as it is in Detroit. But it's also a metaphor for what happens when places that are successful try to prevent change. What happens when institutions that are successful try to prevent change. What happens when countries that are successful try to prevent change. And it can work for a while. It can work for a long while. But as the auto industry learned in 2008, there comes a point at which it doesn't work any longer. And change which had been accruing, like an underbrush in a forest where fires have been prevented, eventually will roar forward and be more disruptive than it would have been if it had been managed in a more progressive, responsible way. Reorganization. Reorganization is what happens after that, right? Now, it would have been possible to construct this talk entirely from North Carolina examples. I'm going to include one. This is a region that has been through multiple transitions of this variety, and the folks who are in this room, I'm sure, have been involved in different places at different stages, many of them. I did bring my notes with me for this one factoid because it's difficult to remember exactly which merger happened when, but 1995 it was Glaxo and Burroughs Wellcome that merged. In 2000 it was Glaxo Wellcome and SmithKline Beecham that merged. I didn't know I could do that by memory. So in any event, these obviously catalytic, very important companies for this region, or an important company that has moved forward. And these eras of layoffs and of disruption that followed both of the mergers actually had a remarkably positive effect on this region, as documented by North Carolina's own Marianne Feldman, who is one of the leading regional economists in the world and a great treasure for the state to have her here as an academic. And she and a colleague of hers, Nicola Lowe, have written about the entrepreneurial influence of GSK and its predecessors. And what they found was that 144 firms were traced to GlaxoSmithKline and its antecedents, Burroughs Wellcome and Glaxo Wellcome. And furthermore, that there was a shift even just from 1995 to 2000, where in 1995, the startups that came out of that merger were mostly contract research organizations. They really weren't early stage research organizations. They weren't doing new to the world stuff. They were basically just doing contract research, which, by the way, this region is now the world's leader in, and is a great line of business for any region. But in the second round of mergers, you saw a deepening of the type of companies that were started out of that. When you talk about 144 firms, that is a tremendous legacy. I mean, even Xerox PARC, which is known for its spin-offs, only created 60 spin-offs, if I recall correctly, the work by Hank Chesbrough. And so this is really an impact of a very substantial variety, and that came out of knowing how to manage a disruption, knowing how to manage crisis. This is not unique to this region. Mary Walshock, who's been long time at University of California in San Diego, and was instrumental in creating UCSD Connect. And UCSD Connect did something very interesting. In the early 1980s, it brought together, we've talked quite a bit about public-private partnerships, this was really a public-private partnership of the best type. It was the business community getting together with the academic community and the city leaders and saying, how are we going to maintain what we have here in San Diego, which is pretty great. We don't feel like moving. We like it here. But we're facing some struggles, right? The implosion of the savings and loan industry, and in the early 1980s, a real collapse in military spending in that region, which had been sort of the bedrock of the San Diego economy for over 8 decades. And so they very purposefully went about trying to build the capacity of San Diego as a biotechnology hub. And it worked. So this is the model: exploitation, conservation, release, reorganization. Underlying it, an understanding that when we talk about economic vitality, we really mean vitality. We really mean that regions are alive, cities are alive. There is an interconnection among people and institutions that is organic, and it behaves in a manner that is not dissimilar from living entities. Anecdote here, anecdote there, figure 8 graph, not necessarily that persuasive. It goes more deeply than that, right? There is a whole other talk one could give about this same phenomenon at a global level. Let's think about China, Israel, Rwanda, Korea. These are countries that have one thing in common. In the case of Israel and Korea, a perpetual state of war. In the case of China, Korea, and Rwanda, absolute devastation that was a prelude to economic growth. There's an MIT scholar by the name of Yasheng Huang who's written a fantastic book titled Capitalism with Chinese Characteristics, in which he argues that the critical time in China's development in the last 40 years wasn't when Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1978 and in 1979 started to enact political and economic reforms that moved China toward a market economy, most notably the household responsibility system. But rather, it was an era before that. The 2 years after Mao Zedong died and before Deng Xiaoping came to power. These were 2 years of almost complete anarchy in a country of then already over 1 billion people. Now you think about a country that for 2 years has no political leadership, no guidance from above. Now I'm not talking about the United States right now. I'm talking about a situation far beyond anything that we might complain about when we say we're not happy with our political process, or we're not happy with the outcomes that we see from the federal government. No, this is a complete vacuum of power in a country of 1 billion people. And what do people do when they have no direction, particularly when they've been in an economy that was centralized against their will for over a generation? Well, they go back to doing what they've always done. They went off the collective farms, and by the way, people being put on the collective farms cost 20 million lives, and it was something that Deng Xiaoping was personally opposed to. And they realized that was a failed model. They went back to their homes. When Deng Xiaoping came to power, he had a choice, basically send out the People's Liberation Army and force people back onto the farms, or validate what was already happening as national policy. The point is that it was this vacuum, this open space that allowed people then to express themselves in a manner that made sense to them, given their environment, that allowed for China to grow. And if we think about what happened in Korea, if we think about what happened in Israel and Rwanda, we see a combination of both leadership from above and this energy from below. And that is the story in China, and it's the story elsewhere as well. So I want to make sure that I leave you with a few takeaways from this model, not just that the entire economy is best thought of as just the forest sector, and not just the essence of entrepreneurial dynamism as being about really a living system, but also just sort of some practical takeaways. And the number one takeaway, and I would say this is less true at the regional level than it is at the national and the international level, but whenever I'm in front of an audience, say World Bank, USAID, even Commerce Department, the number one thing that government needs to do if it wants to favor entrepreneurs is favor incumbents less. It is a natural, and in some ways a healthy thing, that government represents incumbent interests. Political parties are essentially nothing but coalitions of incumbent economic and political interests. Otherwise, they wouldn't be parties. They would not have any sustainable and viable support to represent people. Organizing factions, organizing coalitions of incumbent interests is a positive dimension of a democratic process. But what it means is that whatever elected government we have is going to almost axiomatically represent incumbent interests of one type or another. And it is vitally important for any government that wants to see entrepreneurship thrive and flourish to favor incumbents less as a default rule, to find some spaces, some regulatory spaces, some procurement spaces, and even some physical spaces where the new can exist and thrive. And this requires conscious effort. And particularly outside this country, but even inside this country, this is a huge challenge. And incumbent interests, when threatened, will organize to build up those bulwarks and try to do what seems like protecting themselves, was actually making not just themselves, but the communities to which they're connected tremendously vulnerable. Second point, listen to entrepreneurs. Who are these entrepreneurs, right? When let's say the World Bank, and by the way, I'm doing a project about which I'm very excited with the World Bank, I'm very excited with the World Bank right now, and I feel as though they understand, folks at the World Bank understand all that I'm talking about. But nonetheless, when, say, the World Bank or the USAID goes into a country and are sort of convening business leaders, if you're not talking to the government, a natural thing to do is to talk to the Chamber of Commerce. Well, does the Chamber of Commerce represent entrepreneurs? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. A lot of times the entrepreneurs aren't invited into those meetings, right? Chamber of Commerce is the association of incumbent business leaders, established business leaders. So finding the people who actually are entrepreneurs, who are creating the new, requires really embedding yourself in the community. And we know who they are, right? It's exactly those misfits that Henry was talking about. You gotta find them. And those people don't like coming to meetings, generally speaking. And they, generally speaking, will be fatigued if you say that we want to talk to you about policy for entrepreneurs. In fact, they may not even understand what you're talking about. But you have to try to find them, sit down with them, and then how do you see the world? What is your day like? Is there anything in the action of government that could facilitate your reality? And listen and take notes and register it. It will be different entrepreneur to entrepreneur. It will be different community to community. Nothing can be successful in policy for entrepreneurship if it doesn't begin by listening to entrepreneurs. Once you've done that, it does help to take a little bit of a structural view. And there are tools and techniques to understand how are people connected, right? We have a data-rich environment these days. There's really no excuse not to do it. And so there's no reason to be blind, drive blind, you know? You got Google Maps, enter it in. Where am I going? Okay, what's the landscape look like? Although there is something we've lost with Google Maps, which is that we never actually look at a map. We never actually know where we are. We're just told where to go next, right? Entrepreneurship policy needs more than that. It needs an actual map. You need to know what the relationships are. And there are methods and techniques for doing that. Simple entrepreneurial rule that everybody knows. But it works for policy. Implementing this in policy is difficult, actually. It's not just about, we have a plan, we've done our research, here's the program, all right, now we're going to roll it out, $10 million over 3 years. You know, let's see if it works, and then we'll do an assessment after that, and we'll find out. No, it makes much more sense. Start small scale, gather data, iterate. Entrepreneurship policies should be entrepreneurial, and that means it'll use entrepreneurial methodologies. One of the really strong tendencies, both of academics and of policymakers, but not of entrepreneurs, is to put people in rigid categories. This person is, I mean, even the way I've been speaking about it, it's almost unavoidable, that there's a category of entrepreneurs, but they might be different from, say, angel investors, and they might be different from corporate technology people, and they might be different from people in government. Well, as we know, the most successful people are the ones who just transition between all those roles. They may have multiple roles at once, right? And so we got to understand that reality, that it's really about people finding different identities, both personally and economically, and relating to people in terms of those different identities, and not treating people like they're potted plants. A rainforest is not a greenhouse. Entrepreneurs are not potted plants. You don't move them from one place to another. You don't create a space for them and say, okay, now you're all going to go over here. That's not going to work. And then lastly, my sort of core point, and it relates to the broader theme of this gathering, which is preparing to capitalize on crises. Crises are an organic part of the evolution of economies, whether at a local level, at a national level, or even in one's own life. I would strongly endorse a slightly polemical but nonetheless deeply insightful book by Nicholas Taleb titled Anti-Fragility. And what Taleb is talking about is that systems that really are robust, environments that thrive, actually seek out not just challenge, but volatility. Embrace volatility. Human beings can expect their children to live more than twice as long today as we could 200 years ago. This is the biggest and largest change to have happened in human society. That extended human lifespan means that this reinvention has to happen at a personal level, at an institutional level, at a regional level, at every level, more frequently, more deeply than has ever been the case in the past. We have no poems, we have no plays, we have no novels about the world that we're entering. We have to create our own narratives, we have to create our own visions, and we have to create our own future. So that's basically all I have to say. Thank you very much.